One of the Church of England's set readings for today is a reading that perhaps seems a bit strange to us, and for good reason. It's a reading from Genesis chapter 30, the story of Jacob and effectively his slave mistresses. The reading says this: When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. Because of this I shall name him Dan." Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune!" So she named him Gad. So here's a question. What do Jacob, from the reading we've just heard, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the Reverend George Whitefield, Anglican priest and one of the founders of Methodism, and the first couple of US presidents, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, what do they have in common? Well, they are all important figures from history, and they were all slave owners. Our Bible reading mentions the two maids, Bilhah and Zilpah, given to Jacob to have children with. They had been given to Jacob's two wives, Rachel and Leah, as a wedding gift. Now, Rachel and Jacob are important figures in the history of the Jewish and Christian people and their story. But in reading about their use of slave girls, we should, and I hope we do, find that uncomfortable. And it draws us towards a question that is current in our own society today. Namely, what do we do about figures from our past who behave in ways that, by today's standards, are morally reprehensible? There are plenty of such figures in the Bible, figures who are part of our kind of Christian heritage, who enslave or murder, and often do so in the name of God, or as figures who have an important part to play in God's story. And so we need to think about what we do with them. And then in a different way, but related, there are figures from our more recent British history whose memory we also wrestle with. I'm sure we all remember the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol during a Black Lives Matter protest back in June 2020. And in the news at present has been Tobias Rustat, an investor in the slave trade, whose memorial sits in Cambridge's Jesus College Chapel, where he was a big donor, a memorial which that college is currently seeking permission to remove. So what do we do with figures from the past? Now, there are a small number of historical figures who, by anyone's standards, are worthy of wholesale condemnation. Adolf Hitler, Vlad the Impaler, or Pol Pot. But most people in history and in our history aren't in that kind of black and white category. So what do we do with them? Do we judge them by today's standards? Or do we judge them by the standards of their own day? Should we judge them at all? And what do we do when those figures from the past break into our present through memorials and statues that are still standing, or in the case of Bible characters, how do we approach the sacred texts in which they play an important role. So, should we judge them by the standards of their own day? Well, let's take Tobias Rustat as our example, since he has been in the news recently. He lived in the 1600s, at a time when slavery was, for many, if not for most people, morally justifiable. It was seen as a part of the natural hierarchy, the hierarchy of monarchs, aristocrats, down to knights, down to merchants, peasants, and then slaves. A natural order of things, the way God had ordered the world. That was the kind of prevailing opinion of the day. And so on that basis, few people would have felt the need to raise moral questions about slavery. And on that basis, judging Rustat by the standards of his day, well, he was a philanthropist of the highest order. As the memorial suggests, he gave large sums to Cambridge University. He contributed to the building of St. Paul's Cathedral. He provided charitable support to poor clergy and to orphans. But of course, we live today, and the idea that we would commend him so thoroughly when he was an investor in the slave trade, which to our eyes is perhaps the most horrific crime against humanity that was ever committed. I think we're right to think that. Well, the idea of celebrating him obviously leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. And okay, so then perhaps the answer is that we judge Rustat by today's standards, that we view him in the light of our beliefs. In contrast to his time, I suspect and I hope there are very few people today who think slavery is anything other than abhorrent. We live in an age of human rights, of equality law, a fundamental belief that every human being is of equal worth. And so to enslave people or to make money off of enslaving people is one of the worst crimes there could be. So surely within our moral framework, no matter how much good a person like Rustat does, if some of their wealth comes from trading human beings, then they are to be condemned. The philanthropic ends that they pursued are not justified by those means, or do not justify those means. But of course, interpreting the past in terms of modern values and concepts, well, it is illogical. Why would Rustat have declined to invest in slavery when the moral consensus against it was at least 2 centuries in the future? Should he have defied chronology and been ahead of his time by 2 centuries? I think it's easy for us to feel morally superior, to feel indignation at the terrible things that those people did. But we have arrived at our moral positions by building on generations and generations of collective human consciousness of right and wrong. And because of that, we deserve little credit for our own moral positions. Frankly, if I, with all my convictions about the immorality of slavery, if I had been born when Rustat was born, with his upbringing in his culture, and with the moral beliefs that would have been prevalent at his time, I almost certainly would have been willing to invest in the slave trade alongside him. But I wasn't born then. I was born in the late 20th century, long after any moral arguments about slavery had already been decided. And so who am I to judge Rustat by standards that he couldn't know, and I only know because of the chronological happenstance of my birth? When I think of the debates of today that don't have a consensus yet, I wonder how we might be judged in 200 years' time. One of the big debates in this world at the moment is over abortion. Now, on one side, there are those who are absolutely convinced of the moral right of a woman to choose what happens within her own body. And on the other side, those who are absolutely convinced of the moral rights of an unborn child. Now, 200 years hence, I can see how one side or the other of that debate might be judged with the same force as the likes of Rustat are judged today. But from here, from where we stand, we have absolutely no way of knowing where the moral consensus will end up and how the future will judge us. And I think that should in turn make us circumspect about judging history. So to judge Rustat by the standards of his day leaves immoral action unchallenged, which we don't want. But to judge him by today's standards is illogical. It makes no sense. What then should we do? Well, as is often the case, a black and white solution is not a good solution. And nuance is needed. You see, we need to both to understand a man like Rustat in the context of his day, and also bring to bear the moral knowledge that humanity has gathered since his day. And if we combine that understanding him in his context with the morality of his day, and bringing to bear our moral consciousness, then we can recognize the evil of slavery and the evil of the actions he did, whether he had any idea they were evil or not. But instead of the wholesale cancelling of anyone tainted with that awful trade, what we can do is turn it from a kind of condemnatory, angry thing to a chance to be thankful for the moral progress of humanity since Rustat's day. I am delighted that humanity has reached a point where we think that what Rustat did was wrong. Rather than seeking to judge the past, we can look at the past and see it as a reminder of how far we have come, but also as a reminder and a challenge that we, like Rustat's era, still have room to grow, morally speaking. There will be things that we are comfortable with that we should not be comfortable with, and we need to grow into that. Looking back into the past should remind us of that. Now, there is, of course, still the question of what do we do with memorials and statues? And what I would say to that, I think we have a duty of care to those who are alive today, far more than to people who have been dead for hundreds of years. And in light of that, the need to care for those who might be struggle with or be upset by memorials and statues that celebrate something that oppressed kind of perhaps their ancestors, if we're going to be sensitive to that, then it might well be appropriate to remove memorials, or at the very least, add context to them. Perhaps put memorials alongside them, remembering the countless unnamed people affected, killed by the slave trade. But at the same time, along with the importance of doing that, we have to come to terms with the fact that the entire historic fabric of our nation is inextricably linked with the slave trade. From St. Paul's Cathedral to Nelson's Column, to Green King Brewery, to the Bank of England, to Penny Lane of Beatles fame, and many other places in Liverpool, which was a big beneficiary of the slave trade. You know, all these things built through or for those who benefited from slavery. If we tore down everything with a link to that awful trade, we would have almost nothing left. So we have to find out how to reconcile and re-understand and represent our history in the light of what has happened in the past. But whatever we do with the past and whatever happens with individual memorials or statues, our engagement with that history should serve to elevate our consciousness, both of the past with all its ills and its goods, and also our consciousness of how we should behave towards one another in the present. And turning back towards where I began, and that Bible passage about Jacob, slave owner. So when we read those passages, when we read about those characters, we need to understand them in the context of their day. The Bible is written in the midst of brutal times, of warrior cultures, of societies that had no understanding of the morality that has developed over centuries. They're times long before the advent of universal human rights. The Bible consists of stories about people who were never meant to be put on a pedestal or torn down from one. Jacob and the rest they're merely human beings that are part of a story. They're products of their own time, like the rest of us. They're people with deep flaws and unexpected virtues. I love how Jacob wrestled with God, and I can love him for that and celebrate that without at the same time celebrating the sexual slavery that he participated in and that was common to his era of humanity. We don't have to judge him by his standards or by today's standards, but we can learn from his story, as from other stories, and be grateful for what they did that was good, and be grateful that, morally speaking, we have moved on a long way in the centuries since. And for those who are still with me at this point in the reflection, and it's a long one, I think partly because it's hard to talk about an issue like that in just a few words. But for those of you who are still with me at this point, I want to finish my reflection by turning to Jesus. Because amidst all this talk of flawed figures from history, Jesus alone stands the moral test of time. Whatever standards we might presume to judge by, of all the people in the history of humanity, Jesus stands alone in a category of his own as a shining example of moral goodness. Jesus, who owned no slaves, but instead made himself a servant of all. Jesus, who advocated loving neighbours and enemies alike. Jesus, who touched lepers and welcomed those that the world condemns as equals. There is no one like Jesus, who, despite having every right to judge every person in the past and in the present, chose forgiveness and redemption, chose to offer forgiveness to us and redeem us. Amen.